You play your music and you think, oh, this would be nice to be heard on the radio. But then you have those ugly managers manipulating and taking a situation and making people sign contracts that they don't really understand, of which I did. I signed a lot of contracts knowing what the hell I was signing, which I've since regretted.
Some artists leave the stage to the sound of applause. Others quietly fade away. And then there are those, like Ritchie Blackmore, who choose to exit in a way that is cold, almost bizarre, playing a half-hearted solo, throwing a drink at a cameraman, and vanishing for good after a few final shows with Deep Purple. With his Stratocaster and rebellious soul, Ritchie Blackmore carved immortal sounds into Deep Purple's legacy, from Smoke on the Water to Highway Star. But he was also the simmering storm within the band, the source of conflicts that were never truly resolved. His final years with Deep Purple weren't a triumphant coda, but a slow unraveling of a creative marriage riddled with fractures. And the surprising part is, Ritchie Blackmore felt no regret. On the contrary, he felt relief. "I feel quite comfortable not being tied down anymore," he said after leaving the band. "I'm glad they found someone to replace me. I just didn't fit anymore." It wasn't just a farewell. It was a declaration from the man who helped build the empire and was the first to walk away when that empire no longer reflected who he was. Some geniuses are born to ignite the flame, but once the fire dies, they are the first to walk away, without regret, without looking back. And Ritchie Blackmore, with his steel-cold resolve and untamable ego, did exactly that. But flames don't extinguish overnight. They smolder, burn beneath the surface for over 2 decades, fueled by a silent yet relentless war between the two biggest egos in Deep Purple, Ritchie Blackmore and Ian Gillan. No one understood Ritchie Blackmore better than Ian Gillan, and no one drove Blackmore crazier than that very voice. In the early 1970s, when Deep Purple entered their golden era with the legendary Mark II lineup, Gillan and Blackmore were one of the most dynamic duos in rock. One was a guitar virtuoso whose riffs could set the stage ablaze, the other a high-octane vocalist full of drama. They created masterpieces like Child in Time, Smoke on the Water, and Strange Kind of Woman. Albums like In Rock, 1970, Machine Head, 1972, and Made in Japan, 1972, were direct results of their creative synergy. To the world, they seemed like a perfect match, but behind the curtain, they could barely coexist. Ritchie Blackmore was a perfectionist, quiet, calculating, and obsessed with control. Ian Gillan was outspoken, emotional, and craved expressive freedom. These opposing temperaments couldn't share a creative space without clashing. Small differences soon grew into deep cracks, and their relationship became so frigid they no longer had words for each other. The underlying tension erupted in early 1973. Ian Gillan left the band feeling silenced in the creative process, especially as Blackmore's dominance grew stronger. That same year, bassist Roger Glover, Gillan's close ally, was forced out. Power within Deep Purple now tilted heavily toward Blackmore, and the Mark II lineup officially fell apart. 11 years later, in 1984, Deep Purple reunited. Under pressure from the market and fan expectations, Gillan and Blackmore once again shared the stage. But a decade apart hadn't changed them. It had made things worse. Gillan remained an instinctive performer, often improvising on stage. Blackmore still demanded everything, followed the strict structure he envisioned. They avoided each other backstage, didn't speak in the studio, and constantly clashed during rehearsals. By the late 1980s, the rift became irreparable. Gillan was fired in 1989 and replaced by Joe Lynn Turner, the former Rainbow vocalist, a band Blackmore himself had founded. But the lineup was swiftly rejected by fans, who felt Deep Purple had lost its identity. Starting in 1992, after Ian Gillan returned to the band, the atmosphere within Deep Purple became thick, like everyone was living in a room with no oxygen. Blackmore kept his distance from the rest. He didn't attend band meetings unless absolutely necessary, wasn't friendly backstage, and regularly criticized Gillan's singing, his lyrics, even his behavior. Every show became a psychological ordeal for everyone involved. At the time, the band was working on The Battle Rages On, a project already riddled with turmoil. Before Gillan was invited back, most of the songs had been written to suit Joe Lynn Turner's vocal range. When Turner was fired and Gillan returned, he had to re-record all the vocals over backing tracks made for someone else. A forced, uncomfortable process. Gillan had no chance to co-write or adapt the material to his style, further deepening the rift between him and Blackmore. Still, the promotional tour went ahead. In the fall of 1993, Deep Purple began a European tour. From the start, the cracks were obvious. Blackmore seemed completely disengaged. He often showed up late on stage, played his solos half-heartedly, and kept a cold distance from both the audience and his bandmates. The breaking point came on November 9, 1993, at NEC Arena in Birmingham, a show filmed and officially released to mark the band's 25th anniversary. It should have been a triumphant night, but for Ritchie Blackmore, it was the moment he decided to let go. As the band launched into Highway Star, Blackmore was nowhere to be seen. With his spot on stage left empty, the remaining members struggled to keep the performance going. When he finally emerged, he played his solo like a machine, detached, emotionless, as if simply fulfilling a duty. Then, in a moment that shocked many, he threw a cup of water directly at a cameraman who had gotten too close. That night, Deep Purple didn't just lose a guitarist. They lost the spirit that had once defined them. Just days later, Blackmore announced he was quitting the tour. He left the band decisively. No long speeches, no farewell show, no goodbyes. For him, it was over. Deep Purple brought in Joe Satriani as a temporary replacement to finish the tour, and officially recruited Steve Morse the following year. What's striking is that Blackmore wasn't angry. He wasn't heartbroken. On the contrary, he felt relieved. In later interviews, he openly admitted he was glad to no longer be tied to Deep Purple. He believed his time with the band had run its course, and leaving was the right thing to do. As for Deep Purple, especially Gillan, the emotions weren't conflicted. Despite never hiding their long-standing tensions, Gillan later acknowledged that if Blackmore hadn't left at that time, the band might have fallen apart completely. His departure, cold and extreme as it was, turned out to be a saving grace for the rest. Ritchie Blackmore didn't close his chapter with Deep Purple through a grand solo. He walked away with the indifference of a man who had stayed too long at a party that had long since lost its joy. After leaving Deep Purple in 1993, Ritchie Blackmore never looked back. There was no farewell statement to the fans, no press conference to explain his departure. He vanished from the world of Deep Purple as if it had never existed in his life. To many, walking away from a legendary band at its peak seemed unimaginable. But for Blackmore, it was an act of liberation. Not because he hated the music, but because he had grown weary of the constraints that fame brought with it. For years afterward, he barely mentioned Deep Purple. In the few rare interviews where he was asked about his final days with the band, he simply said, "I just didn't fit anymore. And I think they knew that too." No bitterness, no regret. His answer sounded like someone who had freed himself from a suffocating room he once helped build. Instead of continuing with classic rock, Blackmore turned to his long-held passion for medieval and European folk music, an inner sound that had smoldered within him for years. He formed Blackmore's Night with his partner Candace Knight, playing lute, mandolin, and composing songs that blended folk, Renaissance, and soft rock. To him, this was the world he truly wanted to live in. No screaming crowds, no exhausting tours, no artistic conflicts, just music, classical ambiance, and freedom. While Deep Purple carried on with Steve Morse and maintained their vitality through steady touring, Ritchie Blackmore remained almost entirely detached. He did not attend the band's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2016, even though he was recognized as a founding member and one of its greatest icons. Both sides kept a diplomatic stance. No attacks, no invitations, but also no efforts to reconnect. Blackmore's view of the past held no nostalgia and no hint of remorse. He once said bluntly, if forced to return to Deep Purple, he would feel like acting in a play I no longer believe in. For him, leaving was not a failure. It was a vital decision to preserve his own artistic identity. As for Deep Purple, Ian Gillan confirmed they had made peace, keeping in touch as people who had shared a long journey. But both acknowledged that a reunion was unnecessary. No more grudges, but no reason to continue. In the end, Ritchie Blackmore chose to live true to his nature as an artist, uncompromising, unshaken, and unwilling to imprison himself in the shadow of the past. Ritchie Blackmore may have left Deep Purple, but the legacy he left behind never left the band. If his departure in 1993 was the cold, full stop to a chapter filled with tension, then the rest of the story, from a boy enchanted by sound to the man who redefined rock guitar, is the true heart of the legend known as Blackmore. He wasn't just a member of Deep Purple. At many points, he was Deep Purple. Ritchie Blackmore was born on April 14, 1945, in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, England, into a working-class family with no artistic background. When he was 2, the family moved to Heston, a suburb in West London, where his lifelong love affair with music began. His father, a strict and disciplined man, refused to let his son learn guitar just to mess around. If Ritchie was going to play, he had to learn it properly, through classical training. So at age 11, Ritchie was sent to study classical guitar under Jim Sullivan, one of Britain's top guitarists at the time. Years later, Blackmore would still credit that classical foundation as the key to his unique playing style. As a teenager, he worked as a session musician and joined several early 60s rock and roll bands such as the Outlaws, Hines and the Wild Boys, and Screaming Lord Sutch. But these were only stepping stones. What he needed was a band of his own, a place where he could create on his own terms. In 1968, that dream became reality. Blackmore, along with keyboardist John Lord, drummer Ian Pace, and original members Rod Evans, vocals, and Nick Simper, bass, formed Deep Purple. At first, the band was heavily influenced by psychedelic rock and classical music, as heard on albums like Shades of Deep Purple and The Book of Taliesin. But it wasn't until Ian Gillan and Roger Glover joined in 1969 that Deep Purple truly found its identity. By then, Blackmore had already refined his signature style: speed, precision, classical harmonies, and emotionally charged solos. He transformed the Fender Stratocaster into a weapon of raw, aggressive, yet meticulously crafted expression. With albums like In Rock, 1970, Fireball, 1971, Machine Head, 1972, and Made in Japan, 1972, he and the band laid the foundation of modern hard rock. It was Blackmore who wrote the iconic riff for Smoke on the Water, one of the most recognizable guitar riffs in history. Songs like Highway Star, Lazy, Child in Time, Burn, and Mistreated all bear his unmistakable imprint, from the song structures and melodic choices to the dark, almost mythic tone that shaped every chord. Notably, Blackmore was more than a guitarist. He was the band's unofficial musical director. He actively arranged harmonies, dictated key changes, and crafted compositions to maximize their impact on stage. During live shows, he would often extend solos, turning each performance into a unique, unrepeatable experience. After Gillan and Glover left the band in 1973, Blackmore steered Deep Purple into a new chapter with David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. The Burn, 1974 album leaned more into blues rock, but retained the technicality and classical structure he valued. Although Stormbringer, 1974, sparked internal division, it further proved his musical versatility. In 1975, he left Deep Purple for the first time to form Rainbow, a band that allowed him total creative control. After nearly a decade of exploration, he returned to Deep Purple in 1984 when the classic Mark II lineup reunited. That comeback led to Perfect Strangers, one of Deep Purple's biggest post-70s successes. Blackmore was still at the top of his game. Though his tone now benefited from more modern gear, the classical spirit, the discipline, and the commanding presence remained intact in every note. From the late 80s into the early 90s, Blackmore continued leading the band through albums like The House of Blue Light, 1987, Slaves and Masters, 1990, and The Battle Rages On, 1993. Each release showcased his constant evolution, shifting from classical frameworks to modern hard rock, and later to more stripped-down, expressive melodies. Ritchie Blackmore's journey with Deep Purple wasn't just a musical path, it was a living chronicle of 20th century hard rock. For over 2 decades, he challenged, redefined, and shattered the boundaries of popular music. And even after he walked his own path, embracing Renaissance and folk music with Blackmore's Night, the image of Blackmore with his Stratocaster, long black hair, and piercing gaze on the Deep Purple stage remains an irreplaceable part of rock history for millions of fans. Ritchie Blackmore was not merely an exceptional guitarist. He was the living embodiment of musical personality, an artist who forged a movement only to then veer off into uncharted territory of his own making. And even after stepping away from the grand spotlight of rock, his shadow continued to loom over generations of guitarists for decades to come. Since the early 1970s, Blackmore's sound has been a foundational pillar for the evolution of hard rock and heavy metal. Riffs like Smoke on the Water weren't just famous. They became a rite of passage for anyone picking up a guitar. His riffs weren't overly complex or intricate, but they were razor-sharp, evocative, and iconic. He turned simplicity into strength, and that was his genius. His playing style was a unique fusion of classical technique, influenced by Bach and Vivaldi, with the free spirit of blues and the uncompromising explosiveness of British rock. He wasn't afraid to pull back half a beat to create space. He wasn't afraid to play slowly, or even pause, just to let a final note ring out like a declaration. And that's what set him apart. He played the guitar as if telling a story, not just performing a song. Countless guitar legends have cited Blackmore's influence, from Yngwie Malmsteen, who expanded on neoclassical metal, to Slash, Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, and John Petrucci. Many studied his single-note picking, his left-hand vibrato, or how he used harmonic scales to build emotional tension. To Deep Purple, Blackmore wasn't just a founding member. He was the musical soul, the architect of their identity. As long as he was there, Deep Purple's music carried a sharp edge, a confrontational energy, and a strict sense of structure. After his departure, the band took a smoother, broader direction. But the cold intensity of the Blackmore era never returned. On a cultural level, the image of Ritchie Blackmore with his black and white Fender Stratocaster, long hair, and stoic expression became part of classic rock iconography. He never tried to be a showman. He didn't need to step to the edge of the stage to scream at the crowd. A single flick of his fingers, a cold, piercing solo, was enough to shake the entire hall. Even after shifting to folk and Renaissance-inspired music with Blackmore's Night, a genre worlds apart from what he built with Deep Purple, he remained entirely himself, uncompromising, unchained by trends, and fiercely devoted to his artistic intuition. Ritchie Blackmore didn't just create a style of guitar playing, he created a philosophy of discipline, freedom, and independence in art. And that, more than anything, is his greatest legacy. Ritchie Blackmore was never one to follow the crowd. When the world hailed him as one of the greatest guitarists in rock history, he chose to walk away from the spotlight. When Deep Purple reached its commercial peak, he let go, without regret. And when fans hoped for a grand reunion, he remained silent, playing the lute deep in the forests of Central Europe. He never apologized for being himself, and that is precisely the weight that makes the name Ritchie Blackmore timeless. In a world where glory often comes at the cost of compromise, he chose to protect his freedom. In an industry where the collective voice is often prioritized, he stayed loyal to personal instinct. And in a genre where loudness is the standard, he left his mark with silence, restraint, and haunting precision. Ritchie Blackmore wrote the first chapter of Deep Purple, and he also closed his own, on his own terms, in a way unlike anyone else. And perhaps that is the truest definition of a legend, someone who creates a world, then quietly steps out of it, letting that world live on with only the purest essence he left behind.